Once upon a time, bedroom walls far and wide were adorned with a poster of a certain car. A generation-defining machine that became the embodiment of glamour and excess. The design language that makes up so much of that DNA flowed from the same pen to create a much more affordable 80s icon.
Citroen had big plans for the 1970s, kicking off the decade with the beautiful Grand Tourer SM and the award-winning GS, before following up with the excellent executive CX.
They were working with NSU to bring the rotary engine to life, and had planned a wide range of cars, from an ultra-compact city car all the way up to a large luxury saloon. Unfortunately, the oil crisis intervened. The thirsty, unreliable rotary was a no-go, and the big cars struggled to sell in a world that needed fuel economy to survive. Citroen's owners, Michelin, had no choice but to seek help from Peugeot and the French government. And by the middle of the decade, the old, metropolitan, technologically innovative Citroen ceased to exist. In its place, the very sensible country cousin, PSA. Peugeot looked at the balance sheet and immediately cancelled all of the planned cars, except one. This was Project XA, which had started life as Project GY and later Project X. This was planned to be a mid-sized family car to sit between the GS and the CX. The car would take its major mechanical components from the GS, including the 1299cc engine, with a bored-out 1.5-litre version of the same unit planned. It would be offered as a saloon or an estate car. Citroen's management still did not yet believe in hatchbacks. With the building blocks in place, styling was the last piece of the puzzle. Robert Opron, the designer of the CX and SM, had left Citroen over the PSA merger, fearing creative restriction under the more staid Peugeot. This left Citroen's in-house design team without overall direction, which is incredibly important in cohesive creative projects. Nonetheless, the remaining in-house team produced potential designs through the mid-70s, very much in keeping with the design language of the GS and the CX. In the background, Citroen under PSA became a profitable enterprise. The CX matured into a good seller, even to the point where by 1976, Citroen were able to repay the billion francs the government had loaned them at the time of the merger in 1974, only 12 years ahead of schedule. In 1977, Jean-Paul Parrière took over as president of PSA, with big ideas on the brand positioning of his two French stalwarts. Peugeot would target the traditional market segments, while Citroen would be positioned in novel concept areas of the market. A key aspect of the plan would be coordination to ensure the two brands were not competing with each other, something British Leyland could have taken note of. To streamline the operation, component parts and their development would be shared between the brands. With this, our project got another name change from XA to XB, and would become a Peugeot underpinned car. The old GS engine went in favour of PSA's newer XU unit. One major shared component would also be the floor pan of the new car. A conventional floor would not have provision for installing Citroen's hydropneumatic suspension. This might have been the premature end of hydraulically sprung Citroens were it not for Alain Roche, who designed a platform which could be used interchangeably with conventional coil springs. With the 80s fast approaching, the styling of this car had still not been finalised. The design team were still working with shapes closer resembling the GS of the last decade. Eventually, management decided to do something Citroen had never done in its history, and employ an outside design house to style the car. In early 1978, two of the Italian greats were engaged, Giugiaro's Ital Design and Bertone. Pininfarina traditionally worked for Peugeot and were likely excluded on this basis. By March of the same year, both companies had returned full-size models, sending them to Paris for consideration by Citroen. Ital Design submitted a fairly conservative hatchback, with some nods to Citroen design language. Bertone, meanwhile, had given work to chief designer Marcello Gandini, who quickly came up with a very striking modern design. Gandini was the master of 70s wedge-shaped sports cars, such as the Countach and the Lancia Stratos. This design was very much in the same vein within the confines of a family car. In fact, one of the few modifications requested to the initial design, which was immediately chosen, was to raise the rear roofline slightly to afford better headroom for rear seat passengers. Gandini had no real contact with the Citroen design team during his work. It is difficult not to feel sorry for the team whose years of development work were being passed over for an outside competitor, something which Gandini himself acknowledged. He would go on to own 2 BXs himself during the 1980s, something which Citroen's marketing pounced on. As for the design itself, Gandini considers it to be on his list of designs of which he is least proud, although he does say it's in an acceptable place. Once the design was chosen, Citroen only made minor changes, like the aforementioned roofline and shortening the shell by 2 centimeters. This was the first car at Citroen to be fed into a CAD or computer-aided design system, creating a 3D model which could be used to determine the best structural choices. For example, they worked out that gluing the windscreen lent 16% better rigidity than a traditional rubber seal. The interior of the car was traditionally the domain of Michel Harmon, who, as a big science fiction fan, had created space-age cockpits for the preceding cars. His ideas for the new car were no different, with tardigrade-like seats and a funky triangular instrument cluster. In the end, interior design also went to Bertone, who produced a clean-line design to go with the exterior angles of the car. Fortunately, this retained Citroen cues such as the single-spoke steering wheel and the fingertip controls around the wheel. Prototypes were thoroughly tested and then crash tested, and by 1981 the car was almost ready. In 1978, the Visa Super Mini had been badly received, and Citroen were keen not to repeat this. In another first for the company, they conducted consumer panels in the south of France. The new car was displayed alongside an Audi 80, a Renault 18, a Peugeot 305 and the Citroen GSA. All were presented in light grey without badging. Despite this, 70% of the participants knew the new car must be a Citroen. Gandini had added a novel window in the C-pillar, which had been retained for some versions but not all. During the consumer panel, the cars with the C-pillar window weren't rated any higher than those without. Despite that, the window was kept, as its design and tooling had already been paid for. The car was originally planned to have Club and Palace badge trim levels for the 1.4 and 1.6 engines respectively. This was in keeping with Citroen's old system found on the GS and CX, but was dropped in favour of letter combinations such as RE, RS and TRS. The car's name was decided in early 82. This would be the BX.
The BX was presented to the press in the spring of 1982, when 550 journalists were flown in batches to the south of France and let loose with the new car on a road which would highlight its virtues.
For the BX, Citroen also engaged in another first for any car company, a teaser campaign. Posters all over France showed a happy young couple in the countryside with the caption, "Here is the new Citroen." Of course, there was no car shown at all. In Paris, a box was suspended from the Eiffel Tower, with an announcement that it would be lowered down and opened on the 23rd of September. André Citroen had, before the Second World War, paid to advertise on the Eiffel Tower, so it was only right that the latest Citroen should be unveiled there. On the 23rd, to much fanfare, the box was lowered, broken open, and the new BX christened with champagne. A 20-minute fireworks display followed, and the Eiffel Tower was once again illuminated with the word Citroen. On the same day, all over France, 1,350 BXs were supplied to the various dealers, along with the showroom marketing materials. The car was ready for sale. The posters all over the country were replaced. Where the happy couple had been in each one, an image of the BX now sat, just as the real BXs began to sit in prominent places: airports, shopping centres, railway stations. The marketing campaign paid off. By October, between 1,000 and 1,200 BXs were sold every day in France. By November, the 25,000th car had been ordered. The advertising agency RSCG was behind the marketing. In another first for the automotive industry, the BX was pushed as a living thing, rather than a technical specification, something that made you feel good. Not necessarily the fastest car, but a nice place to be. While 1973 had been bad timing for Citroen's big cars and rotaries, the BX was just in time for PSA. The second oil crisis in 1979 had compounded losses which were already being felt from the rise of Japanese motors in Europe. PSA had acquired the ailing Talbot brand and not done anything to make it more popular. Even Citroen's and Peugeot's small cars like the Visa and the 104 were unpopular or outdated, and the 604 was struggling itself in the executive market. By 1982, losses were at 1.1 billion francs. Jacques Calvet was appointed vice president just in time to take advantage of the new BX's success. In true Citroen fashion, aerodynamics were a large concern, and the BX achieved a 0.33 drag coefficient with its slippery bodywork. There are no rain gutters, and the bonded windscreen creates minimal drag. Rust prevention was also focused on, to combat Citroen's reputation here. The bonnet and boot lid are made of fiberglass, which helps to make the car lightweight too. Galvanized steel was used at the worst rust points, as well as stainless bolts.
The interior of the car managed to be as spacious as the much larger Peugeot 504. Early cars retained a very Citroen dashboard layout with rotating drum speedometer and fingertip pods for controls. The seat scroll wheels are at the front rather than the back, so you don't have to reach backwards to use them. The fuel filler cap is integrated with the door, so you don't have to worry about losing it.
The BX would share its floor pan with the Peugeot 405, which would debut in 1987 with a conventional McPherson strut coil spring suspension. Thanks to Roche's clever design, the BX was able to accommodate Citroen's hydropneumatic suspension. The most common suspension systems found on cars at that time were some combination of coil springs at the front and either coils or leaf springs at the rear. This is a fine setup. It does the job perfectly adequately. Citroen's system does away with springs completely and replaces them with metal spheres with nitrogen-filled balloons inside. This nitrogen-filled balloon is able to compress under the hydraulic pressure and absorb the shocks of the road. With a traditional suspension setup, you have to choose between a car that rides soft, is comfortable, and one which handles well in the corners and perhaps rides a bit harsher as a result. The neat trick with Citroen's system is that it will do both. It wasn't thought possible to invent such a system. The man who penned it, Paul Maget, had no technical training, and so was able to apply unconventional wisdom. The principle is simple. With increasing loads, the nitrogen gas pressure becomes higher, so you can have stiff suspension through the corners and soften it again on the straights. In the BX, Citroen's system was altered slightly to use McPherson struts, but replaced the coil springs with suspension spheres. The BX debuted with 5 model options: the BX, or basic spec, BX 14E, 14RE, 16RS, and 16TRS. The R stands for Riche, the TR stands for Très Riche, while the E stands for Economic, and the S stands for Superieur. The basic and the 14s were fitted with a 1360cc PSA XY engine found in the Peugeot 104. These were base model cars without frills, aimed at cars like the VW Golf and Ford's Escort. The 16s were fitted with a 1580cc PSA XU5 engine and aimed at bigger competition like the Renault 20. These early 16s got the C-pillar window, while the 14s didn't. The 14 engine put out about 70 horsepower, while the 16 managed 90. The car was received well and attracted a lot of new customers to the Citroen brand, on top of the brand loyal customers from the days of the DS. In fact, it is estimated that more than half of BX customers were conversion sales, people who had previously driven a different brand. No doubt partially due to the Gandini styling, which was so unlike Citroens of the past. In 1984, Citroen introduced a diesel-engined BX. Previously, diesel power had been reserved for the big cars expected to do high mileages. As technology developed, it made more sense to install smaller, economical diesel engines to mid-range cars such as the BX. PSA's XUD9 was chosen, in 1905 cc's. This engine was already used successfully in the 305, making 65 horsepower. It delivered pretty reasonable performance in the lightweight BX, with excellent fuel economy. As time went on, models with sporting pretensions were added, such as the BX19 with the 1.9 litre XU9, and later the fuel-injected GTI. In 1986, an estate car was introduced, designed by Hules and built in-house by them, from scratch rather than converted saloons. Later, an 1100cc saloon was introduced to replace the aging GSA. This was the BX11. There was also a very unsuccessful Group B rally car, the BX4TC, which is a story for another day. The midlife facelift of the BX saw some cosmetic changes to the outside. For example, the indicators, but largely to the dashboard area, where the fingertip pods departed in favour of traditional stalks and a less Citroen instrument cluster. From 1992, the Xantia started to take over from the BX, which soldiered on until 1994, especially in estate form. The BX was almost like the acceptable face of Citroen. The firm had survived and innovated under Michelin for years, often shocking the world and the industry with beautiful or unconventional cars. Unfortunately, by the 70s, this caught up with them, and their loyal customer base was no longer enough to sustain the company. In the PSA merger and the external styling of Bertone, the BX brought together a more conventional engineering with a wider appeal to the apprehensive masses, as well as style evoking Italian supercars.
The little four-cylinder hatchback in and of itself is nothing special. It's not the fastest, it's not technologically groundbreaking, but it's comfortable, it's interestingly styled, and it's a nice place to be. Everything a family hatchback should be.
Thanks for watching. If you want to dig deeper on the BX, I recommend A New Generation of Citroen, published by Citrovisie. I'll put the link in the description below.